Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what is pure experience?
What do you mean?
How can one understand and enter the state in which experience is occurring free from any and all hindrances and limitations? What does a person have to do? Can our hindrances and limitations even be overcome and tossed away? Or are they inherent and inescapable?
The Buddha would say that pure experience, without hindrances and limitations, refers to experiencing one's life, thoughts, emotions, mind states, etc., free from concepts, desires, beliefs, and mental formations about the very things you are experiencing. You are fully present. The lights are on in your mind. However, you are not inserting or attaching any thoughts, beliefs, or notions onto what is happening before you. And you're not filtering out parts of the experience due to any such thoughts, notions, and beliefs. You are an open book, with nothing written down, available for the unfolding of experience to write upon you honestly, completely, and unimpeded.
Fascinating. How does one free themselves from these hindrances and limitations?
It begins and ends with meditation. Changing the habitual unfolding of one's thoughts takes concentration and persistence. Changing one's beliefs requires deliberate thought, which is directly contrary to your beliefs. Changing one's notions requires deliberately seeking out other interpretations, experiences, and perspectives about the same thing.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be discussing non-attachment in Buddhism. What is non-attachment in Buddhism? What texts discuss it and how? How does the definition of the term change over time? We hope you enjoy. So, what is non-attachment in Buddhism?
This is a concept in Buddhism that is mentioned, discussed, and interpreted many times throughout Buddhism's history, and yet it is one of the least well-understood ideas in Buddhism, at least among Westerners. So we should discuss its different meanings and its history in the canon. But first, as always, we will mention what it is called in Buddhism's different languages. In Pali, it is nekkhamma. In Sanskrit, it is Naishkramya. In Chinese, Wu Nian. And in Japanese, Munen. We will point you to the show notes for the spellings. It is also often associated with and interchanged with the Chinese word Bu-ran, which means unstained or untarnished. We'll clarify why it has that extra definition when we talk about non-attachment in Zen Buddhism in particular. So how does one define non-attachment? The most frequent answer to this question refers the listener to the middle way. If you remember from our prior episode on the middle way, which I will link in the show notes, the middle way is an approach to living and thinking that avoids absolutes and extremes and seeks to find completeness in the middle between those extremes. The most obvious example of the middle way is the Buddha's response to the various religious practices he tried out before setting out on his own. When he was still a prince in the palace, he lived in extreme sensory indulgence and outright hedonism. His every hunger, thirst, desire, craving, and urge was fulfilled and then some. So he renounced and practiced extreme abstinence and asceticism. He starved himself of food, he practiced meditation without breathing, and he deprived himself of sleep. He didn't find any fulfillment here either, so he found the middle path, which is Buddhism. You abstain from realizing every single desire and craving you have, but you also eat, drink, sleep, and breathe enough to support your meditation and your study. This is the Buddha's practical approach to the middle way, but there is also a conceptual and theoretical aspect to it as well. In one's views of the world, one will not find vindication and satisfaction in extreme and rigid views and beliefs. For example, middle way philosophy, which is discussed extensively by Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, holds that, on one extreme, there is believing that things exist eternally, and on the other, there is refusing to acknowledge that things exist in front of our eyes and refusing to acknowledge any sort of causal continuity exists among those things at all. Both of these extremes are incorrect. Believing things exist in some unchanging and everlasting manner is incorrect because all things are subject to impermanence and therefore change constantly. There is no such thing as eternity, and nothing has the characteristic of eternality. On the other hand, believing nothing exists and/or that existence is all imaginary or a random hallucination or a simulation is incorrect because of the possibility of changing one's experience through meditation and practice. Thus, the middle way is to realize that at the core of all small d dharmas is shunyata, translated as emptiness, nothingness, voidness, etc. Shunyata doesn't deny the fact that stuff exists right in front of our faces in a relatively continuous manner, but it does recognize impermanence. Yes, the mountains near my house don't exist in an everlasting and eternal way, and they don't have everlasting and eternal nature, but they are there, and I can go to them and see them. However, if I visit again in 500 million years, they likely won't be there, at least not in the same form. Thus, the result is the middle way, existence only due to causes and conditions. So what about non-attachment? There is a middle way application to non-attachment as well. One extreme is attachment. Attachment is defined in Buddhism as persistent desire for X that creates delusion. X could be anything. It could be an object, a substance, a person, an experience, an emotion, a mindset, a state of being, etc. Literally any small d dharma can be substituted for X. It could be desire to have X if X is a pleasurable or neutral experience, and it can be desire for the absence of X if X is a painful and unpleasant experience. In Sanskrit and Pali, attachment is called upadana, and it is usually translated as clinging, attachment, or grasping.
I'm brought to mind the original definition of lust. In modern times, lust refers specifically to sexual desires, but in older times you could have a lust for power or a lust for anything, really. I think that is a better way to capture this in English.
Very true, it is. What is interesting is that the literal meaning of upadana is fuel, and the reason why is that it fuels the process of continued existence in samsara. The way that this works is that attachment creates the delusion that getting X will satiate the desire you have for X. However, desire in Buddhism is by definition insatiable because of the law of impermanence. If you desire happiness, that is insatiable because you will experience feelings other than happiness in this lifetime. If you desire to not be thirsty anymore ever, you can drink water now, but then you will be thirsty again later. That delusion causes or fuels continued existence because you will continue to seek out satisfaction for that desire, and your actions in doing so will create karmic momentum that fuels further rebirths in samsara. The biggest desire and attachment is the desire for the existence of a capital S self. The accompanying delusion is that such a self exists, but it doesn't. This process is laid out more in detail in the 12 nidanas, or the 12 steps of dependent origination. So, one might think that the other extreme, total detachment, is the solution to attachment. Detachment is the state where you seek to cut yourself out of the cycle of birth and death by starving all of your desires until these desires themselves die or wither away. This may seem like a path to Buddhahood or enlightenment, but it actually isn't. There are some desires that are wholesome and conducive to getting enlightenment. For example, it is good to have a desire to save all sentient beings, a desire to become a Buddha, a desire to free yourself from delusion, etc. Thus, the best approach is the middle approach, which is non-attachment. You may have heard the expression, have your beliefs, but don't believe them. That is non-belief. And so non-attachment would be something like, have your attachments, but don't be attached to them. It is a state of equanimity where you don't starve and punish yourself for having desires and attachments, which are related to your humanity. But you still seek to remedy yourself of delusion, and you prevent yourself from letting unwholesome attachments take root. For example, is it wrong to have feelings of desire for food and water? You're a human being, and you need to eat and drink to live. That desire is only bad if it makes you commit evil acts or it causes you to have horrible beliefs. So the middle way is to be mindful and acknowledge the desire or the attachment, but work to remove the roots of attachment and attain freedom from delusion. Be cautious, because sometimes nekama or naishkramya is translated as detachment, but that's incorrect. It should be non-attachment.
What texts discuss non-attachment and how?
The term nekama comes up first in the Pali Canon, particularly in the Maghavibhanga Sutta, the Dveda Vitaka Sutta, and the Nisaraniya Sutta. These texts all relay the attachment as fuel versus nekama scheme I've laid out here. We'll read and discuss those in the future. There's another interesting text which puts this into the perspective of the six senses. This text is called the Fire Sermon, or the Adita Pariyaya, and in it the Buddha preaches to his audience that everything, all of reality, is on fire. By everything, he means all small d dharmas. He means the six senses, their objects, and the operations and feelings they give rise to. These are all burning with the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. People are greedy for what they want, hateful of what they don't want, and deluded about the nature of everything. Upadana, or attachment, clinging, etc., is fuel for this fire. Desire leads to attachment. Attachment leads to both greed and to hatred, and greed and hatred lead to delusion. In this scheme, it is important to note that total detachment is not the solution that the Buddha presents. He does not say that shutting out the six senses will lead to the fire going out. That's simply another type of fuel for the fire, an expression of greed for annihilation, hatred for the three poisons, and delusion as to the nature of the world around us and the way to freedom from the poisons. The solution is non-attachment, which is the continual practice of shaping one's worldview and attachments in such a way as to put out the fires altogether by means of succumbing to the three poisons less and less often. This concept is also, of course, discussed in the works of the philosopher Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka school materials. These are philosophical and Abhidharma texts which make philosophical arguments and elaborations making use of the sutras as reference and subject. Someday, many kalpas down the line, maybe after we have discussed hundreds of sutras, we will read and discuss some of those. They're extremely difficult to understand for a layperson, and they're often untranslated into English. These texts relay the relationship between emptiness and non-attachment that I laid out earlier as well. Finally, there are some Chan and Zen treatises which discuss the concept in Chinese of Wu Nian, or in Japanese, Mu Nen. These words are fascinating because they literally mean no thought. It refers to the idea of not letting your mundane, everyday monkey mind thoughts drag you into a state of attachment or desire, or otherwise a state where your mindfulness practice is threatened. In New Age Western Buddhist psychology, you frequently hear the expression about thoughts being like clouds in the sky, and so when you see them rise, you notice them, and then you don't interact or interfere, you just let them pass, and you're a passive observer. This metaphor is based in part on this concept of Mu Nen. It is the process of noticing but not being carried away by something. Wu Nian or Mu Nen is often associated and interchanged with the Chinese word Bu Ran, which translates to unstained or untarnished. This is a much more interesting concept because it refers to one of the more fascinating metaphors in Chan and Zen meditation. In Chan or Zen, there is a strong emphasis on eliminating notions, beliefs, conceptions, mental formations, and the like, and having a mind that is like a perfectly polished, clean mirror to the world exactly as it is. This is related to the esoteric side of Zen, which is that the entire world has the nature of Buddhahood already. So if you clean your mirror and reflect that Buddhahood perfectly, you too will be a Buddha and realize your shared Buddha nature. The state of being Bu-Ran is being free from such conceptions, mental formations, etc. The idea is that those things prevent us from experiencing or perceiving the world exactly as it is, like stains on the mirror. And that's how the idea of unstained and untarnished is related to this idea of no thought, but also non-attachment.
How does the definition of non-attachment change over time?
In the early Pali texts, there is a strong monastic bent to the term. As we talked about when we were talking about the life of the Buddha, non-attachment had a lot to do with the question of how to properly renounce and practice Buddhism. It played a massive role in the development of Buddhism into something distinct and separate from contemporary ascetic traditions, because it prescribed the proper Buddhist approach to renunciation and to ascetic practice. This approach struck a happy medium between totally negating the world and everything and everyone in it, and totally indulging at all times. Later on, it came into play in these philosophical elaborations of different doctrinal concepts, such as emptiness, by Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka schools. These elaborations also played a huge historical role in setting the story straight about Buddhism for its critics. Ever since the life of the Buddha himself, people have learned about emptiness or impermanence, and they have immediately responded with Buddhism is fatalist, or Buddhism is nihilist, or Buddhism is world negating. That has been going on for all of Buddhism's history, not just in the modern Western world. Nagarjuna's elaborations on the Middle Way and its relationship to emptiness and non-attachment and so on helped put a lot of that to bed. Even further on, in Chan and Zen Buddhism, it became psychologized more and more. When I say that, I mean that it shifted from an approach to experience and to living in the world and in phenomenal reality to being a state of mind, or being in relation to one's own mind. Instead of it being a guiding principle with regard to renunciation or with regard to your approach to living, it shifts to being a principle that determines reactions that you have to your own thoughts and to your own experiences. In this, it becomes highly personal, individual, and mind-centric.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of non-attachment in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing Akshobhya. Who is Akshobhya? What are some stories about him? How is he depicted in iconography? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.